Good evening, everybody. It is very exciting to be with you here for this End It Now online summit. How exciting is it to get to have this chance to spend some time together on a, would you call it a Sabbath evening? It's kind of a Sabbath evening, right? My name's Bradley. What I do is I'm a producer for the Faith FM radio network, and I'm going to be acting as our host this evening. So I'm really looking forward to spending, this next hour or so with you. And we're going to be talking about an important topic for us as Christians, for people in general, of understanding trauma and how the church can respond to this issue. So this is the fourth online End It Now summit that we are part of. And before we get going, because this is, something that can be a difficult topic to deal with, we are dealing with real issues, emotional issues, real life things that people have to deal with. We are going to play a brief trigger warning just at the start so that everybody's comfortable with what we're doing in this conversation and how we can respond to it in an appropriate way.
End It Now is an important social justice initiative of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. AdSafe is proud to be partnering with End It Now in its mission to raise awareness and understanding of domestic violence.
The prevalence of domestic violence in our society demands urgent action.
Through End It Now, we have a really valuable opportunity to start some important conversations, to access some really helpful resources, and to deepen our understanding.
By working together, we can help ensure that our churches are safer places for everyone to access, including those experiencing domestic violence.
AdSafe is extremely grateful for the important work of the enditnow team in organising this summit.
Awesome. Well, shout out to AdSafe, and thank you for all the very important work that they do in our local churches and in our broader church community. We do want to mention that, if throughout this evening, if any of the topics or conversations that are brought up bring challenging issues to light for you, and you need someone who you can talk to share and be heard, we will be sharing, you can see that there is a text line there. That's not a text line, that's a number that you can call if you would wish to actually speak to a counsellor right now this evening as we're going through. My apologies if you're hearing any noise in the background. So those numbers will have people that you will be able to talk to at any point throughout this evening. They also want to put up some helplines for things like Lifeline and also like a men's helpline. Again, don't let these issues, that if they do come to mind for you, don't let them be something that just sits in the back of your mind and you don't deal with it. It is okay to talk to people about any of these things that we're going to cover this evening. If you can hear the noise there, I'm actually coming to you from a train station in Tuggerah in New South Wales. And the reason I'm sharing that is that's actually one of the exciting things about getting to do an online summit in this sort of fashion. Some of the guests that we have joining us today are coming from all around the country and indeed all around the world. And it's going to be very exciting getting to talk to them. We're going to share, some of the details a little bit later in the program. If you have questions, comments throughout the night, feel free to make those on any of the video platform comment sections that you might be watching. You can do that on YouTube or on Facebook. There's also the text line that you can use to send in comments and questions. If you have an anonymous comment or question that you would actually like to send through for our presenters as we go through the evening, there is an anonymous question number that you can text this to, which you can see on the screen there, but it is 0401 219 037. Feel free to send those through and we will address those to some of our panelists as we go on through the night. I do want to give a quick shout out to some of the people who are already listening and watching. Shout out to Wendy, to Beryl, to Musu and Sylvia, Claire. Yeah, thank you for what you've shared so far. And yes, this is a very exciting thing we're going to be doing tonight. So without much further ado, I want to actually go into sharing a little bit about the person who's going to be giving our keynote presentation for tonight. His name is Dr. Torben Bergland. He is one of the Associate Directors of Health Ministries, the Health Ministries Department, rather, of the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And Torbin is originally from Norway. He comes from a pastoral family and he did his residency in psychiatry at, where was it? At Modenbad Clinic in the Oslo University Hospital and also the Vestre Viken hospitals in Norway. He actually did his MD at Copenhagen University in Denmark, which is a place that I've actually been. I haven't studied there, but I have been there once. He is a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist, and he does have a special interest in working with patients dealing with issues like depression, anxiety, and personality disorders, which, let's face it, whether it's someone who is a Christian or not, we can face these problems in the people that we deal with, and maybe they're problems we face ourselves. So Dr. Bergland unfortunately couldn't be with us live tonight, but he has recorded, Wendy is mentioning, definitely a huge amount of world experience for our keynote speaker that I'm really looking forward to discovering as well. So Dr. Bergland has recorded a presentation that we're going to enjoy for the next 20 minutes or so. It includes some of him presenting, and it also includes some really great animations because, these topics of trauma and mental health, we will actually want them to be accessible to everybody to understand, not just crowded in academic language that makes it difficult to understand the topic. So we hope you enjoy this presentation over the next 20 minutes or so. And as you're watching and listening, remember, feel free to send in your comments, your questions, because when we come back from this presentation, we're actually going to be introducing you to our panel members for tonight. And those comments and questions that you can share at any point will be things that we can address to them. So let's go and enjoy this video from Dr. Bergland.
Thank you for the invitation to share with you and to give you a brief introduction to the topic, the issue of trauma. I commend you for choosing this as a topic, and I hope you will have a good summit where you can delve into these issues, understand them better, both so you can help and support people better, and also be better at empathizing, and also discuss how the church community can work to counteract that trauma occurs, and also to discuss how we can support when it happens. I'm Dr. Torben Bergland. I'm a psychiatrist trained in Norway. For the last years, I've been working in the church, for the church, promoting especially mental health globally, first as in the Trans-European Division, and the last years at the General Conference in the Health Ministries Department. I have my very first job in residency as a psychiatrist was at a trauma unit at a hospital in Norway. We had patients who had been traumatized, sexually traumatized in childhood. Often patients would come when they were in their 30s, 40s, or even later. Some had managed well for a long or fairly well, somewhat well, maybe through their 20s. But sooner or later, for many of them, the trauma they had experienced caught up with them and impacted so many aspects of life, relationships, professional performance, and many of them had post-traumatic stress disorder. Some even had dissociative identity disorder, which is a severe form of trauma. And I found that very meaningful. And since then, I've had a passion for helping and supporting these patients and people. One of the projects that I've been working on for the church has been the Reminded project, where we have produced resources on mental health. We launched it last year. We are continuing to work with it. And we'll develop more resources, content on it. You can find all of this online at the website reminded.org. And today I want to share with you some of the resources that we have created, some of the videos we have created on trauma, as I think they are a good introduction to the complexities and challenges of trauma and understanding what it is. So if you go to the website, you can find these animations that I will share with you and more. I don't have time to share all of them. We also have created a short film on trauma. That's the story is a female who experienced incest in childhood, and like we follow her into adulthood on what she struggled with and also how she was helped. On the website you will also find videos on anxiety and depression. But what I will share with you is 4 animation videos. The first one is what is trauma. Second is what are the symptoms of trauma. Third one, what causes trauma. And then fourth one, what is the traumatized brain like? How is the traumatized brain? Two more videos in the series that I don't have time to show, but I would refer to the website. So there, I would recommend to just go and watch that. They are on trauma recovery, which is, of course, is very important. But I will now I will share with you the videos, play them sequentially. So I hope these can be informative.
What is trauma? Since the beginning of history, we have sought to be loved, safe, and happy. Sadly, we live in a world where, sooner or later, we all experience hurt, harm, and death. Trauma is the result of events that emotionally overwhelm us and our capacity to cope. They are unbearable and intolerable experiences. Trauma leaves a lasting impact on how we feel, think, act, and relate. Trauma is not so much about what happens to us in the outer world as what happens inside us, in our inner world, as a response to a traumatic event. The impact of traumatic events differs between different people. Neglect, abuse, or violence, whether physical, emotional, or sexual, often results in trauma. Other traumatic events are accidents, natural disasters, war, or something negative happening to someone we know. Research indicates that 70% of us experience at least one traumatic event in our lifetime. It happens to family members, friends, neighbors, classmates, and colleagues. Trauma does not end when the traumatic event ends. Although it's no longer happening in our outer world, it continues in our inner world. We may relive it in memories, dreams, and flashbacks. We may live with constant stress. We are on the lookout for threats and danger. We feel that something bad could happen at any time, and we're easily triggered. The world feels like an unsafe place, and life becomes about how to survive. The effects of trauma may endure for weeks, months, years, and even decades. They affect how we see ourselves, how we see others, and how we see the world. Trauma may become the glasses through which we see, experience, and interpret everything. People who have survived trauma often blame themselves for being weak, for being failures, think it was their fault they couldn't protect themselves or others, and may even feel responsible for what happened. Often they have a deep sense of guilt and shame. They may think they are worthless, wrong, and damaged. If you are suffering from trauma, you may need to tell yourself, I am not bad, but I struggle because something bad happened to me. It is possible to overcome trauma, but the traumatized mind and body need time to recover. It takes time to rebuild a sense of safety, confidence in oneself, and trust in others. But it is possible. We cannot change what happened in the past, but we can change how the past impacts us and our lives. Life for a trauma survivor may be challenging, but there is hope. In the next videos, we'll explore the symptoms of trauma. What are the symptoms of trauma? After a traumatic event, some recover quickly. Others are not able to return to normal. They keep living as if the traumatic event never ended. They have become traumatized. The core symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, are intrusion, avoidance, hyperarousal, and numbness. Let's have a closer look at each of these. Intrusion means that the traumatic event is relived as memories of the traumatic event that suddenly intrude into the present moment, recurring fearful dreams or nightmares. Flashbacks where one feels and acts as if the traumatic event is happening right now. Avoidance is an attempt to avoid distressing memories, thoughts, feelings, and reminders of what happened. Hyperarousal is a state of chronic stress where the person often has heightened alertness, is easily alarmed, has increased irritability, and problems with concentration and sleep. Numbness is feeling distant and detached from almost everything, including oneself. It may be difficult to connect in significant relationships. Feeling anything except fear, anger, guilt, and shame may be difficult. Interests and activities that used to be important and enjoyable may not feel significant anymore. Even the memory of the traumatic event may be fragmented and incomplete. A severe form of numbness is dissociation. Dissociation is a disconnect from the present. One feels disconnected from one's own mind and body, and from time, space, and what's going on around. Things may feel unreal and dreamlike. When such symptoms last for more than a month after a traumatic event and cause significant distress or impaired functioning, then it may be PTSD. Repeated traumatic events, prolonged trauma, especially childhood trauma, may lead to complex PTSD. In complex PTSD, there's often dissociation, difficulties regulating emotions, negative self-image, relational difficulties, and loss of hope, meaning, and faith. Trauma is hard to experience and hard to live with, but there is hope. It is possible to overcome trauma with time, treatment, and supportive relationships. In the next video, we'll explore the causes of trauma. What causes trauma? 70% of us will experience at least one traumatic event in our lifetime, and many suffer after such experiences. Globally, around 4% of the world's population will experience events that are so distressing, threatening, and overwhelming that they will develop post-traumatic stress disorder. What are the most common causes of PTSD? Sexual violence, such as rape and other kinds of sexual abuse and assault, is the leading cause of PTSD. Sexual violence is all about violence and not much about sex. It's evil, hurtful, and harmful. Claims of sexual violence are usually true. They should not be dismissed without careful consideration. The second leading cause of PTSD is domestic abuse. These are behaviors that frighten, intimidate, terrorize, manipulate, hurt, humiliate, blame, injure, or wound someone within the walls of our homes. For each person traumatized in war or conflict, many more are traumatized at home by someone who should have loved and protected them. One of the most common traumas is an unexpected loss of a loved one. It can lead to complicated grief and PTSD. Other major causes of PTSD are traumas related to war and conflict, witnessing something negative happening to someone we know, and experiencing physical violence, accidents, and disasters. In general, the more intense and long-lasting the traumatic event was, the higher the risk of PTSD. Who is most vulnerable to becoming traumatized? Generally, males experience more traumatic events, but females are more likely to develop PTSD. Other vulnerability factors are younger age, having experienced earlier traumas, including adverse childhood experiences, previous mental disorders and substance abuse, lower socioeconomic status, and lack of social support. In this world, trauma is a reality. Many traumatic events are people willfully hurting people. Traumatized people need someone who will stand with them, protect and defend them, and who will be kind, compassionate, and supportive. In the next video, we will explore what trauma does to our brains and our bodies. The traumatized brain. Trauma affects three significant parts of the brain: the thinking brain, the feeling brain, and the instinct brain. While the thinking brain is slow, the emotional brain is quick, and the instinct brain works automatically. When faced with danger, the emotional brain responds instantly and activates the instinct brain to get us out of the dangerous situation. Meanwhile, the thinking brain may effectively be shut down. The feeling brain first considers escape or defense. Adrenaline and cortisol are released. Heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing increase. Energy is released, and alertness is heightened. The brain and body are ready for fight or flight. One has become hyper-aroused. If one feels helpless and trapped, and fleeing or defending oneself is too dangerous, the brain and body may shut down instead. Acetylcholine is released. Heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing decrease. One loses strength, awareness shuts down, and one feels numb. One may not even sense physical and emotional pain. This is the play dead or freeze response. One has become hypo-aroused. Dissociation is such a freeze response. In traumatic events, the thinking brain does not choose fight, flight, or freeze. The feeling brain takes control and responds before the thinking brain is aware of what's happening. Oftentimes, people who have experienced trauma feel guilty and ashamed for what they did or did not do. It's important to understand that during a traumatic event, the brain does its best to help us survive. Since the thinking brain may effectively shut down during traumatic events, memories often become fragmented, incomplete, and inconsistent. Instead of a story, traumatic memories are often re-experienced as flashes of images and intense emotional and physical reactions to triggers. When someone experiences a traumatic event or has a traumatic life, the feeling brain may become hyperreactive and dominate the thinking brain. The feeling brain is constantly scanning the environment for dangers and easily triggers fight, flight, or freeze. This constant stress destabilizes the instinct brain and may lead to difficulties with sleep, appetite, touch, digestion, and arousal. Dreams, nightmares, and flashbacks may activate the same reactions and deeply engrave the trauma into the mind. For the traumatized brain, ordinary things may lose significance, and one may become detached from everyday life. When one is constantly in survival mode, there is little room for life's ordinary joys and sorrows. To manage the ongoing stress of trauma, some turn to addictions and other destructive strategies to cope. In the next videos, we will seek to understand what someone who is traumatized truly needs and how one may overcome trauma through effective self-care and treatment.
For the next videos on trauma recovery, I refer you to the website. If you go to the menu, click at animations, scroll down, you will come to the trauma animations, and there you will find video 5 and 6, which are on trauma recovery. Also on the website, if you go to films, there you will find the short film on trauma. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope this is a resource also that you can use and share with others, whether they are suffering, whether they are supporting someone who is suffering, or for teachers, pastors, health professionals, people who in a professional capacity are seeking to help. So I wish you all the best for your summit. Thank you for the work you are doing. It is very important, and I hope and trust you will be a blessing to many. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, I just want to say, I'm just going to double check that you can hear me all right. If someone give me a thumbs up. If not, I will just keep talking. Yeah, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Bergland basically for what he just shared there. I mean, yes, it is a video recording, so unfortunately he wasn't there live with us. But I think there was a lot of wisdom in those videos, as we saw just there. And speaking of a lot of wisdom, we have a fantastic panel of guests for you tonight, a lot of experts in this field of mental health, and in particular, this whole topic of trauma. How do we deal with trauma as Christians? How do we deal with trauma as individuals, but also as a church community. I think it's really important that we discuss and consider how to do that. We can't just let these things sit in the background and cause people to be continually experiencing pain, because I don't think that's something that God intended for us. And throughout his ministry, we saw Jesus reaching out to people who had experienced incredibly traumatic things in their life and helping them to heal from them. So as you've seen with some of those reminders popping up on the screen there, if what we heard during the presentation, if it has raised any problems, any issues for you, I do want to encourage you to reach out. We do have a counselling team who is available for you to speak with right now. So if that is something that you need to do, please send a text message to the number on your screen, 0450 732 377, and we will have somebody who can call you back. We don't want anybody to feel like they're left in the dark in terms of how do they actually deal with these issues. So what I would actually like to do now, thank you for everybody who is sharing their comments so far, and thank you for being very kind and respectful. That's an awesome thing to see. I would like to now introduce some of our panelists for this evening, and I'm going to start with Colleen Savage. So Colleen is actually the Family and Children's Ministries Director for the North New South Wales Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. She has a master's in social work, and she has done a lot of training in something that's, to me, very interesting, this idea of trauma-informed care. Colleen is also the secretary on the enditnow advisory team, and enditnow, of course, is the organisation that is bringing you this evening. So I'm going to just welcome Colleen to the stage now. Thank you for joining us this evening, Colleen. What I will do is I'll actually just introduce each of our panel members, and then we'll start directing some different questions to you as the evening goes on. Is that okay?
Sounds good. All
right, good stuff. Our next panel member I'd like to introduce to you is Associate Professor Ingrid Slikers. Now, Ingrid, I'm going to give you complete permission to rebuke me if I pronounced your name wrong. But Ingrid is a professor of social work at Andrews University in the United States. She is the Executive Director of the International Center for Trauma Education and Care, which to me sounds like an absolutely fascinating thing. And before coming to Andrews, I understand that she has worked as a child and family therapist for over 25 years. So to me, I hear that, and I hear a lot of valuable experience and wisdom that we're all going to be able to gain a lot of insight from. So thank you, Ingrid, for your willingness to join us this evening. Next, I would like to introduce Andrea Mahanu. Now, funnily enough, Andrea, you may not know this, but I am somehow related to you because I'm married to a Romanian. But Andrea is a therapeutic practitioner who works with women and children and young people who have experienced trauma due to family violence. Now, family violence is a very important topic for all of us to discuss. Andrea has a background in psychology and did her postgraduate studies in developmental trauma, another very interesting area. So again, thank you, Andrea, for your willingness to join us this evening, and I'm looking forward to what you have to share. And finally, I want to introduce Dr. Horatio Selegia, who I believe is another Romanian. I love seeing all these interesting connections. Dr. Selegia's area of specialty is actually in psychiatry, and he's done specialty training with children and adolescents in that particular area. So let me just see if I can actually get him to the screen here. There we go. So Horatio, thank you again. Thank you for your willingness to join and share. And I guess what I'd actually like to start off as we get into a bit of a discussion this evening, I want to remind everybody, please feel free to send in questions for our panel. Maybe we can, with the order that I introduced people, so starting with Colleen, can you tell us a little bit about we've heard from Dr. Bergland just before, a couple of very important things for understanding things like post-traumatic stress disorder. And what I want to start with a question is, how do we deal with what we would call helplessness? I want to, because this is something that some of us may have a little bit of knowledge about if we understand a little bit to do with mental health. Helplessness can be a sort of state that we often fall into when we feel like there's nothing we can do. And when it comes to Colleen, I want to say, for you dealing in family and children's ministries, where do you see helplessness coming to the front? Where do you see it, I suppose, in an individual context? Over the last couple of years in Australia, we had a lot of difficulty with lockdowns and COVID and that sort of thing. Do you see helplessness as something that has increased over the last couple of years?
Hi, Bradley. Well, research says that since COVID, helplessness and mental health has increased. And a sense of helplessness can also be an anxiety response, one of those, the fawn, fight, flight, fawn or freeze modes. And one of the first things that I would say from helplessness is, for a person to have resilience, is the first thing is to feel safe, physically safe, and to have safe relationships to start off with. Hold on from there.
Good. No, I think that's very true. That's very important. We all have a hierarchy of needs, and physical safety is one of those fundamental ones. You would almost say at the bottom of the pyramid. I suppose from there, and I'd like to suggest it to our panel members. At any point, I'm going to be trying to direct questions to each of you. But if there's something that you hear that a different panelist is sharing and you're thinking to yourself, ooh, I've got something really important to share on that, please feel free to jump in after they've finished contributing. It's all very open and easygoing here in terms of how we're going to be approaching this. So maybe we can jump then to Ingrid next, because Ingrid, for you being based not necessarily in Australia, I guess maybe I can ask that same sort of question. In terms of how things like COVID and lockdowns have affected people in your country, have you seen an increase in, I suppose, people presenting with feelings of helplessness, whether it's in their family life or in their personal relationships or in work?
Absolutely. And sadly, I think it's around the world, right? I think what COVID did, we're seeing it in kiddos, right? Really in children because of their development. But really the isolation that it caused, right? The separation that it brought, that we still continue to see, even as things reopened, people, things like even shaking hands so we're no longer, we're not even doing that, which we used to do. So even human touch has even more disappeared. And we know that affects us. And so sadly, around the world, isolation is really, really impacting us. And COVID only made that worse.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think I've seen that in young people at my church who really struggle to actually form relationships. There's always a bit of a generational thing. Younger kids maybe don't interact with older people quite as much. But today it seems to be this complete disconnect. And it's perhaps, maybe it is like ongoing trauma from feeling so disconnected from people for so long. Okay. Well, I'm not claiming to have the answers. You guys are the experts here. But I want to now just jump over to Andrea. And Andrea, in reading a bit about your bio, I saw that you'd shared that you actually deal a lot of the time with families, with men, with women and children who unfortunately have experienced family violence in their life. And I suppose what I would want to ask is, again, is this something that you've seen increasing over the last couple of years? And what do you think may be things that are contributing to that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely been an increase. Since COVID, we see the statistics that have come out. In Australia, we have 2 women a week who are killed in a domestic violence relationship. 1 in 4 women will experience, by the age of 15, will experience intimate partner violence, and 1 in 14 men. And in Victoria, in our state, it is every 6 minutes, police will be called out to a domestic dispute in the home. And those are the statistics that we have that are reported. There has been an increase because of the isolation factor. So because children have been behind screens and people have not been going in, or they've been staying in. So there's been that kind of factor when it comes to what's been happening, especially in Victoria. When we talk about the different intersectionalities and the different factors that contribute, I work in the community sector, and I work with families who have suffered intergenerational and ongoing trauma. And we see substance abuse, and we see a lot of childhood trauma that has contributed to forming the view of a relationship and what a family looks like. And that has a huge impact on the way families are formed later in life. And we see this kind of evolution from a family where it was broken, and then we have that cycle that continues. And we do see that there's cycles that are broken, and there are things that happen and people can get out of that. But we see, at least in the work that I do, it is an intergenerational pattern that has occurred. So there are many, many things that can contribute to the dynamics in a family violence relationship. And when I speak about family violence, it's a very nuanced area, and it's an area where, I could speak about it for ages, but it is very much, there are certain aspects and certain dynamics within it that can be generalized to community, but then can also, it is very dependent on the dynamics of that family.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I think in mental health, it is very important that we treat everybody and every case as an individual. There's, we can attempt to make some generalizations, right? But everybody is an individual. And, we saw Jesus in his interactions with people always treated them as an individual. So thank you, Andrea. Yeah, that's a really important thing to share. Horatio, I want to jump over to you now. And I was just thinking about something that Andrea sort of shared there, that, in some of these instances where you are dealing with things like family violence, you kind of have these questions of like, where does the trauma come from? Does the trauma originate from, a genetic thing? Like, are some people more inclined towards violence than others? And then that's what instigates the trauma and starts the cycle? Or do you, I guess this is kind of like a nature or nurture sort of question, really, which is, maybe biology 101. But I suppose in dealing with these sort of issues, for you as a psychiatrist, I guess I'd like to ask, what's the basic approach?
Basic approach of understanding why somebody is presenting with trauma.
Yeah, like I'm not an expert by any means in the field of psychiatry, but I suppose what I'm trying to say is it a sort of thing where some people experience traumatic events more traumatically than others? Is that the case, or?
I think we're all different, and indeed some people are more resilient when it comes to traumatic experiences. And you saw from the videos from Dr. Bergland, that 70% of people experience trauma, but only 4% develop PTSD, either because the traumatic event was very intense or because they were. Sometimes we talk about sensitization. If you've been through traumatic experiences in the past, that makes you much more vulnerable to become traumatized again in the future. So there are multiple factors. It depends a lot on your social supports, how good of a support structure you have around you. That's talk about this, supportive relationships as being the best buffer in trauma. For instance, here in Victoria, there was a big study for the survivors of Black Saturday bushfires, and they did a cohort following these people up. I think it was like 400 people, and basically the ones who developed PTSD and depression were quite often those that were isolated, didn't go to work, were single or widowers, or didn't have work or unemployed. So the lack of social supports is very a big vulnerability factor. So there are combination of factors, as you said, nature versus nurture. There are genetic components, there are early sensitization. For instance, in depression, one of the highest risk factors is losing a parent by the age of 11. So going through early childhood trauma sensitizes you. And then sometimes you have a buildup of not very intense traumatic experiences, but for instance, the child who's abused over a period of time, all these micro traumas build up and you can develop complex PTSD, as we call it. So this type of PTSD, that's a kind of a build up of injuries, not as intense of like a rape or a physical assault or something like that, but again, a build up. That's another mechanism that people can lead to a type of PTSD as well. So it's quite often we talk about formulation, we talk about predisposing, precipitating, perpetuating factors, and then protective. We talk about the kind of all this, try to be as holistic as we can when it comes to understanding trauma and also what would be good to put in place for these people to recover.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I want to actually move to that sort of thing now, because I guess, in talking about all these sorts of things, we do want people to not just go away and go, oh no, there's a lot of trauma and there's a lot of pain and challenge and difficulty in the world, right? Because we know that that's obviously going to be true. But we do want people to actually be able to understand, well, what can I do? And even if it's just the very first next step, it doesn't have to be, where is my life going to be in 10 years' time? It can just be, well, what am I going to do tomorrow? And so I guess I want to start opening the floor up to each of you as we start to share some different questions on this sort of thing. And so maybe let's just start it in a very general sense. For somebody who has experienced a traumatic event, and let's say for the sake of it that it is something very recent, so they've just experienced it, what is the best thing that they can do on day one?
If someone comes to you and is very traumatized, the best thing to do is listen. Just listen what they have to say, and not in a non-judgmental way, because they've been through a lot, and it's very brave of them to come to you first. So listen, affirm what they have to say, validate their feelings. That's where I would start.
Bradley, I don't know if you were thinking, if I'm the person, Colleen, that was great. That's exactly, if I'm the one listening and someone's coming to me, I guess I understood the question to be if it had happened to me. So first I want to acknowledge and say, just the acknowledgement that you're willing to say, okay, something's going on with me. In the trauma education field, we do a lot of talking about to name it is to tame it, right? So we've got to name it. And since we are in this environment right now as Seventh-day Adventists, as Christians, many times we feel shame at bringing up whatever the situation might be. Obviously, right now we're talking about end it now and violence, and even that, not even's up the wrong word, mainly that we don't speak up. say it. We don't get help. There's embarrassment, there's shame, there's fear. And so that's a really big thing we've got to do, is be able to say, we've got to name it. So Australia, so proud of you that you're having this conversation, right? Because we've got to say it. First and foremost, we've got to be able to speak it without shame, and also acknowledge that, again, proud of you, Australia. And really, as a world church, we've come a long way, where we're now acknowledging that it's not out there. It's here. It's us. It's within us, right? It's happening to us. And making sure that we're also understanding. So that's what I would say to us, to each of us, that it isn't because I didn't pray hard enough, or I didn't read my Bible hard enough, that I could have prevented this, and or to get over it, I need to be doing more of that. So thank you for having this conversation.
Yeah.
I like to say, when I'm in session with someone and we're speaking about what they've gone through, I say you need two things to facilitate healing. And that is to process the memories of what happened, and to find ways to manage the impacts of those memories. And when I talk about trauma, and when I'm trying to explain it, especially to someone who may not understand fully, or even to a child, I say, think of your brain as writing down on pieces of paper throughout the day. We're writing things down, something will happen, and your brain will start writing things down and throwing them everywhere instead of putting them in the filing cabinets. So by the end of what has happened, you have papers all over the floor. And sometimes your brain will pick up a paper and will try read it and be like, I don't know where to put this one. It will bring a memory up to you and try to file it away. And it's a very primitive way of describing the way that our brains process and sit with memory. And another thing that I think people are not aware of is the physiological impacts of trauma on the brain. High levels of cortisol, especially in early childhood, can impact your brain, especially your memory. So there's research and there's studies that say that it can actually shrink areas of your brain, which is crazy. When I first heard that, and fully to understand that trauma can have such a physiological impact, it was really eye-opening to see that it goes beyond just the psychological impacts. So when we're talking about healing, just think of your brain with the papers scattered everywhere in the filing cabinets and trying to pick them up and put them away. And when I describe therapy, when I talk about therapeutic intervention, that's what I say. You're coming each week and we're trying to sort through some of the papers. We're sorting through and we're putting in the filing cabinets, and this is how we're kind of processing some of those memories. So someone who has gone through a traumatic experience and they have their memories all jumbled up, that's okay. And that's a very normal response to what is happening. And taking that time and taking it slow. And Ingrid, I love that you mentioned that shame around it, because there is especially when we speak about family violence, there's so much shame. And I think in the church, it's even so much more than in society. So sitting in that space and acknowledging that, I think, is the first step to picking up those papers and going through them and putting them in the filing cabinets.
Can I add to that? I love what you said, Andrea. Thank you. And physiologically, as we know, when we're in survival mode in that emotional brain, as it was in the videos, when we actually talk about it, we get back into our thinking brain, when we can start to rationalize and think things through and to problem solve. We need to talk about it to get back into our thinking brain.
Yeah, thank you, guys. And one thing I just wanted to quickly ask, and maybe this can be a question towards Ratio anyway, because, coming from more the field of psychiatry, when it comes to things like cortisol, some people can just say, oh, well, you can just take then medications, drugs that lower your cortisol level, and then you'll be fine. Then you've dealt with it because you're calm now. But is that actually the case? When you go through a traumatic event, if you're just kind of suppressing the cortisol, is that actually helping you deal with it, or is it just kind of pushing it to the side?
No, we don't have any medications which lower the cortisol directly. The medications we use in psychiatry work in other ways. But yes, we know that cortisol is the main hormone that kind of mediates stress and goes up in after traumatic experience, and then people are like within complex PTSD. If you have this protracted elevated cortisol levels, they can predispose to developing depression and anxiety. So being in that intense state of fear and repetitive traumatic experiences can be very damaging, because this cortisol is not supposed to be at high levels for a long duration of time. And if it does, like in autoimmune kind of illness, it starts attacking its own body. It starts attacking our body, and then you start having physical problems, like problems with the stomach. You can have mental health problems. You can collapse into depression. So definitely you want that cortisol to go down, but it's not. We don't have medication to target that directly. Just going back to what you mentioned about how to help somebody who is just recently went through difficult experience. I think Colleen mentioned that one of the first things is for the person to be safe, to be away from the perpetrator, because recovery and therapy cannot start while the person is still home with the perpetrator. The trauma persists. So that's the first step, is feeling physically and psychologically safe. Then from what research shows is not rushing into what we call processing the trauma. Quite often in the immediate stage, the emphasis is on day-to-day functioning, focusing on continuing the routine as much as you can, going to work, going to school, surrounding yourself by a good friend, not isolating yourself, but being surrounded by your loved ones, and not kind of jumping straight into what happened. In the past, we used to have this debrief teams that used to go, in the States, FBI, whenever there was something, you had all the psychologists rushing and interviewing right away. And we know that the immediate debrief after trauma increases the risk of PTSD. So now we never jump quickly into, exploring what happened. We let the person focus on the here and now, deal with the insomnia, deal with the anxiety, the stress, help the person focus. So that's kind of in the immediate aftermath. Later on, once things settle, and if the person is in more of a baseline kind of mental state and they do want to express what happened, process the trauma, then that's when you go into a exploratory therapy like trauma-focused CBT or EMDR, some of these evidence-based therapies. But it's good to do this staged approach first, here and now, bring the person back to normal functioning. Then when they are ready, then we can go into exploring and processing what happened.
Thanks, Horatio. Yeah, no, I think that's very true. And maybe for me as a bloke, it does feel like that sort of thing when I have something that I go through and it is traumatic. My initial gut instinct is I've got to deal with it right now. I can't just let it sit there and because it's here in front of me, and if I can deal with it right now, then then the problem will disappear. And of course, that's not necessarily true. We have had a few listener questions coming through, and so I think it's important for us to actually bring some of these up and we can have a little bit of a chat about them. I just saw an interesting one just before. Now let's see if we can show this on the screen. So Wendy is saying, what is the relationship of trauma with resilience? Is one causative and the other a response, or is it more complicated? Would anyone like to have a crack at that one? So I guess, maybe for me looking at that initially as saying, do people who are more resilient experience less trauma, or are they just better at dealing with it when it happens?
Well, we know that the basis of resilience is safety, physical safety, and safe relationships. So if people tend to have safety or feel safe and have safe, trusting relationships around them, they tend to be resilient or more resilient than others who don't have those support systems around them.
Yeah, it's really fantastic that you brought that up, Colleen, because the relationship between safe relationships and resilience is so strong. There's a really fantastic book by Dr. Bruce Perry, and it's a free audiobook that you can listen to on YouTube, which is amazing. And it's called What Happened to You, and it speaks about trauma and childhood trauma, and it touches on this idea of the importance of relationship, especially in terms of resilience and post-traumatic growth. So after a traumatic episode, what does that look like for that person? And in the book, Dr. Bruce Perry talks about two different children and their responses to a traumatic event. One who had family that surrounded them, and one who was put into foster care, and looking at the eco maps of both children, looking at the relationships between both. And the resilience of both of them was really dependent on who they had around them. So this idea of safe relationships is so important when we talk about trauma. It's probably one of the biggest factors, what I think personally, one of the biggest factors when we look at how do people heal from trauma. The bottom line for me is relationship and safe relationships.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Like obviously discussions that are to do with resilience, to me, I kind of instinctively go back to Dr. Martin Seligman. And I remember reading his book, Learned Optimism, a few years ago. And one of the things he commented on is that in his practice, he found that Christians actually tended to be, on the whole, more resilient than the average population because of the fact that they have hope. And, I guess, if you go into learned optimism, the standard sort of things, you have permanence, pervasiveness, and does anyone remember the other one? Personalization. And I think it was Ingrid before who mentioned the notion of shame when it comes to trauma. Do you think with shame, for instance, is it something that, because in a traumatic event, right, as Dr. Bergland mentioned in his presentation, people seem to almost re-experience it over and over when they bring up that memory? In their minds, is it a permanent thing that, what has occurred to them cannot be changed? Is that something you see commonly?
Yeah, I think one way to look at that and shame and the body responses, and Andrea, thank you for bringing up Bruce Perry and others. Sandra Broom has done a lot of research, and really within trauma, the question that, we have to shift our perspective, and instead of looking at someone and thinking, what's wrong with them? What's wrong with that person? Or even ourselves, right? When we look in the mirror, what's wrong with me? Doing the pausing and wondering what's happened to that person. It shifts your perspective. It shifts it for others. It shifts it for us, which then takes us, just to add to the resilience conversation. Interestingly enough, there's been a bit of debate about even the word resilience, because when you look it up, it means you, like a rubber band, you come back to the state you were in before. So some of the discussion is, can you really come back to the state you were in before the trauma happened? We know that that's not possible. And so the shift, again, Andrea brought up the terminology of moving into, what does post-traumatic growth look like, right? That we can't go back. And isn't that the message of the gospel, right? The post-traumatic growth that's possible, the healing that's continuously possible. And I saw in the chat too, the comments about relationship and how we can have those in the church if they're not possible in our families. And that's the beautiful message, I think, of us gathering together right now as a church and being able to say, how do we do that? Because really, the goal should be that as a church, we're going to come together to put all the rest of us out of business, meaning the rest of us that are here as therapists. That should be the goal, because when you look at the traumatologist as they study, yes, we all refer everybody to counseling and therapy, but I can say, and the traumatologist and the science tells us, you can heal without a therapist, but you cannot heal alone. Right? So that's where we've got to talk about how do we intentionally, and we started this with the word shame, Bradley. I'd love for us to not even have to bring up that word, that we are in such community where we've moved those lenses of what's wrong with you. It's just what's happened to you. So the shame goes away and we can be together and in community.
Thank you so much.
And that's where I think as a church we have a lot of progress to make, because there's still a lot of comments that, just pray about it. You're mentally ill because you don't have enough faith. Just, pray about it, fast about it. And definitely there's, faith in spirituality is a very strong resilience factor. But sometimes people just need mental health support, particularly when we deal with severe mental disorders like PTSD is definitely on the severe end of the spectrum. Just prayer and fasting sometimes might not be enough. And we need to dispel all the stigma about, oh, don't go to a psychologist, don't go to a psychiatrist. There's all this weird stuff happening there. No, mental health is just a branch of medicine, very research and evidence-based, very serious. So many times I talk to church members who, when they hear that I'm a psychiatrist, I get bad looks, and I would never send somebody to a psychiatrist. We still have a lot of growth to experience in our church when it comes to accessing mental health support, unfortunately.
Yeah, Horatio, 100%. Sorry, Brady, I've just got one thing to add. Sometimes ministers would say, to partners who are experiencing domestic violence, they would say, okay, well, let's do marriage counselling. And that could actually do more harm than good, because the victim might feel safe in this environment and then say things and then go home and be abused further. So it would be better for the pastor then to refer them to psychologists, to professionals who work with that.
Well, the question I was going to ask, I guess, based off both of those things is, in a church context, some of the common types of abuse and trauma that people might experience might be things like physical trauma, physical abuse, emotional abuse, but spiritual abuse is also a real thing. And do you guys think that spiritual abuse can actually sometimes be somebody saying, no, you don't need to see anybody about this, it's a spiritual issue, you just need to try and pray and then it'll all be fixed? And if that doesn't happen, well, then there's something wrong with you. How do we deal with that in our own communities? I mean, I obviously, in having this conversation here, where we're trying to say, all right, let's give ourselves the tools to be able to do it. But, I suppose for a lot of people, their first point of contact when they're going through or have gone through some sort of difficult traumatic event would be, well, should I talk to my pastor? And, I'd imagine a lot of pastors may not actually be equipped to deal with that sort of thing. So what would some advice, I suppose, be from you, professionals in the mental health field, to pastors when they have people approaching them with these sort of, approaching them as pastors with some of these sort of challenges?
I would say that it's really good for the pastor to get to know the community around them, community around the church, see what support systems are around the church and in the community, and make contact with them. That'll be a really good place to start to refer people to. And of course, the most important thing is first to check if someone does come to them, is ask if the children are safe. Children's safety is first and utmost. And if they are not safe, then, call the police and get help straight away.
I think about this quite regularly, because working in the field and then being an active member of my local community and local church, and kind of balancing the pastors and how they're trained and what they're told, and then the training that's received in the community and outside. And I think when pastors take an interest in understanding trauma and looking into what is considered trauma-informed practice, they'll actually find that it's very similar to the way that Jesus was and that Jesus practiced with people. And I like to say that Jesus was the first trauma-informed practitioner. The way that he worked with people and he came down to where they're at. And when we talk about trauma-informed principles and we talk about safety and trust and we talk about empowerment and choice and that collaboration that comes with working with someone who has experienced trauma, and when we talk about someone who has experienced violence, especially in the home, all of that choice is taken away from them. So sitting with someone, and pastors or church leaders, when they sit with someone and they sit and listen and it's judgment free, and then they apply the principles that Jesus applied, which wasn't just, oh, pray about it and it'll be okay, because Jesus didn't say, just go away and pray about it and then come back and then we'll fix it when you're all better. He did so much more. He healed the sick, and he was there for people who society considered to be not worth anything. So when we look at the life of Jesus and the example that he gave us, that is the ultimate example of how the church leaders should be. And yeah, I loved when I was going through the trauma-informed principles and then reading through the Gospels and saying, oh, actually, this is a direct reflection of how we practice and all the policies that we have around that. So yeah, looking at that, and yeah, when you make yourself familiar with the terminology out there and the supports, I think is really important. And being part of these kind of conversations and opening these up in a way that, I could talk about it forever because it's one of my favorite topics, but yeah, for me, that's all I'll say for now.
So I'm going to add, so important what you just said about the pastors and how we're all talking to each other and how it takes a community. And so I'll even pop back to what I said about the importance of relationships and the power of that. But then the balance of what Horatio said and mental health resources, and then the balance of the role of the pastor, and even at times watching the chat of calling the police. And like Colleen said it, where I think some of what's happened is we, and I'm going to say we, each of us as members, let's just look at it as members, tend to wash our hands frequently. We're like, oh, we referred them to a therapist. It's all good now. Or, we're not even going to talk about it, right? So how do we all come together with all of our professional roles, but also our human roles of just being present? And yet mental health practitioners are vitally important. Like Horatio said, the family, we've talked a lot about the importance of it is part of our health, right? We may need medication. We all do need counseling. I encourage everybody to get counseling. It's important, right? But that's not the only thing. So if I am a children's ministries leader and I see a kiddo that may be struggling, it's not enough for me just to give that family a card of a therapist and say, go take your kid to therapy once a week, right? How do we all come together?
If I could just jump in, I traveled to PNG for the medical clinic, a part of the PNG for Christ in April this year. In PNG, Papua New Guinea has the highest rate of domestic violence. 80% of women suffer domestic violence there. And I had the chance to talk to many women, and many told me the experience of going to the pastor just sending them home to the abusive husband and just pray about it. But then they went to women's ministries leader, which was a lady, who said, don't go home, it's never going to get better. So knowing how to navigate the system sometime and get help, because let's face it, our pastors and our church elders and leaders need to be trained a bit, that sometimes just prayer and fasting is not enough. And you need to see your general practitioner. That's always the first line, who can do a brief assessment. If you're indeed traumatized or depressed or anxious, they can refer you then to a psychologist. So not having this or approach, either prayer or mental health. You need both. You need prayer, you need support from the church community, but you need to see your GP and you need medical support and mental health support. So being inclusive, we don't have to kind of have this or approach, and you need both spiritual, but also medical and mental health support. And that's where I think training our church leaders and pastors, I think is so important, because it's still not happening all the time. Even here in Australia, I still hear cases of going to the pastor and then being sent home to just pray about it and be a good wife, and then the abuse persists, which breaks your heart.
Great. So with the End It Now committee, we've actually started to put a Breaking the Silence booklet, information booklet together, and there's a website that's going to be launched for pastors, teachers, Sabbath school teachers, Pathfinder Adventure leaders, anyone who's interested in this, to inform our pastors more about what to do, where to go.
That's fantastic, Colleen. And I think we might be sharing it a little bit later in the evening, but we do have a website link with some resources that we will direct anybody who's listening, who's watching, whether now or in the future, to be able to actually learn a bit more and, potentially even take this discussion that we're having tonight and say, just listening to this can equip you with some tools to be able to know what to do in those sorts of situations. Because I think, as Ingrid referred to, the church as a community is a body. And when we see one part of the body in pain, you don't just cut your hand off and say, oh yeah, it's no problem now. We need to be aware of what's going on in the community. And I suppose it's in part that kind of following up and that accountability, based on Jesus's accountability with that he has with us, being in that relationship. You want to make sure people are doing well. You want to make sure that they're improving. And I guess one of the things, actually, Ingrid, I wanted to ask you about, because I saw in your bio something that really stood out to me a little bit. Your interest in something called trust-based relational interventions. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Because I think trust is actually, when it comes to helping people deal with trauma and the connections, trust is something really, really important. And maybe in communities, we don't have as much trust as we would like.
So trust-based relational intervention is frequently known as TBRI. Colleen is smiling because she has also been trained in TBRI. It is a model that is evidence-based, specifically working with children who have experienced trauma. And what's really beautiful about this model, I love the title, right, of how they chose it, because it's all about relationship and connection building. For example, one of their terms that always sticks with me is connection before correction. So if I'm working with a child and there's things going on, I've got to make sure I connect. But I've used that even in leadership and as a manager, right? And I think we can use it in our churches. Have we connected before we're correcting? Isn't that what Jesus does? Isn't that what he did, right? So concepts like that are fully trust-based and looking at the importance of that. So the additional piece, I think, that we can draw from the TBR model for our purposes is that healing is holistic, meaning healing, yes, we need to go to our therapists, we need to go to our counselors, we need to go to, all of the systems, but healing also comes with things like good sleep, healthy food, right? And that's not just for kids, that's for any of us. If we have struggled with trauma, Andrea talked about the physiological things, right? Or what are we putting in our bodies? Because the brain is an organ. Looking at movement, looking at exercise, looking at the role of being in nature. And again, we go back to, we have this as a denomination. We have our health message of how that can be part of our healing. So yes, some of that it's fascinating that TBRI is promoting that, but we've known that in our church, for years, and now the science is backing it up.
Yeah, thank you, Ingrid. And yeah, like that idea of connect before correct. I really like that. I'm going to be writing that down on the top of one of my notebooks because I really like that idea. Look, guys, it's currently 10 to 9 now, so we've got about, let's say, 10, 15 minutes before we're going to wrap up for this evening. I guess maybe where we sort of want to land this is, or maybe that's actually something that I can offer to you guys, rather than me saying, oh, let's talk about this. What is the next step for, whether we say the Adventist Church or whether we say Christianity in general, when it comes to dealing with issues of trauma? What's the most important message that we can display? And I'm not talking like physically, but like in our own actions in terms of what we are doing as a Christian movement to reflect Jesus to the world around us when it comes to issues of trauma. Hopefully that question makes sense. If not, I'll rephrase it.
I can jump in because some thoughts came to mind. So we didn't mention the Adverse Childhood Experiences study yet this evening. And for those of you that aren't aware, just a quick Google search will let you know about that research. And that research just really rocked our world in recognizing the impact, right, of trauma, the long-term impact of trauma. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because I know that when I talk to individuals and I say things like, on the 10-point questionnaire, and again, there isn't time now, but people can look into it. If you've got an ACE score, like if you marked 4 of those 10, there's things like you're 700% more likely to use drugs, or you're 1,200% more likely to consider or attempt suicide because of what's happened. And so many times I go back to our original of, instead of saying what's wrong with you, like, why are you using drugs, or why are you cutting, or why, pausing and shifting and acknowledging that stuff has happened, right? So how do we shift our view of people so that our churches can become places of healing?
Yeah, I really like that. And, again, it's, to me, I kind of hear that, and I think, that's what an important part of what Jesus came to do. He never shied away from recognizing that, yes, there are problems, but before, correcting people, he reached out to them and showed that he was there and that he cared. And, whether it's in issues of trauma or anything else, right, that ought to be a real fundamental characteristic of every Christian if we are to be reflecting Jesus. So I can see Julia here is putting in an interesting question and basically saying, is there hope? And maybe that's a good question to ask, because, if as Christians we believe that the world is getting worse and worse, coming to the point of when Jesus returns, is there actually hope, or are we just going to be experiencing more and more trauma as we get closer to when Jesus returns?
I think it's going to get worse, but this doesn't mean that we have to just throw our hands in the air and say it's too much. We just wait for Jesus to come. I always like the metaphor of the churches being hospitals where people come to deal with their sin problem and get better. But I think they have to be more than that. I think we have to be, holistic communities of support, love, care. And part of that, I think, is also understanding more about what's causing people to suffer. And that's where we go back to having more awareness, more training in church, more enditnow summits, more training for pastors, elders. When was the last time you heard the pastor talk about mental health or preach about mental health? We don't really talk about that. There has to be more discussion about that, so people are not, scared when it comes to that. We should all be aware that, you know, sometimes people struggle, and church should be where they should get that kind of base of support, love, care, acceptance, without getting the stigma, the shame, the guilt that quite often they can get in the world. And I like this metaphor of stepped approach, step care approach, kind of knowing when somebody needs a bit more TLC, more tender loving care, knowing when somebody needs mental health support, like they're not functioning, they cannot go to work, they cannot go to school, they cannot go out shopping, they are obviously struggling getting mental health support. And then when somebody is suicidal, when do they need acute, immediate intervention? So being aware of this kind of ladder of intervention when somebody needs support, and then not being worried to ask somebody, hey, are you okay? Hey, do you need help? How can I help? And being aware that asking somebody if they are suicidal, if they have dark thoughts, if you're really concerned that somebody is depressed, is this person going to do something? It's okay to ask them. Nobody gets more suicidal if you ask them. You're never going to put ideas into somebody's mind. If you ask them, hey, are you struggling with bad thoughts? Are you struggling with thoughts to hurt yourself? No, they're going to have such a relief that somebody is asking, okay, the problem is on the table. What do I do? And then, of course, if somebody has acute suicidal thoughts, take them straight to emergency. You don't just, let's talk about it, let's pray about it. That's time to get immediate mental health support. So this is where we need to train our members, our pastors, our elders. And it's a gradual process. And I think it's chipping away one step at a time. And I think this summit tonight is one step in that direction.
Yeah, thanks, Horatio. I guess it's that idea that, you know, we can't wipe away ourselves personally every crisis that's going to happen. We can't stop people from having trauma, but as Christians, we can be there and ready and have the skills and the tools and, you know, the training, that like the sort of things we're talking about tonight, that when we see someone who's gone through trauma or we see it's happening, as Christians, we can then be there to say, I'm here to listen, I'm here to connect, I'm here to help. What can I do? And I think that's very reflective of Jesus and the way he did things. Colleen and Andrea, I just want to pitch to you guys if there's a last little thing you'd like to share this evening before we close for today.
Yeah, there's a Zulu proverb that I really resonate with, and when I started my therapeutic practice really stuck with me, and it says that you cannot wipe someone's tears without getting your own hands wet. And this idea that when you sit in someone and you hold space for someone, it can be sometimes uncomfortable. And I know when I've had to co-regulate with a child and they're completely dysregulated and I have to sit there, it can be uncomfortable. But when we know our deeper purpose and our deeper meaning, and we see and we take point from who Jesus was and what he did and what he has done for us, and when we base everything from that point, that's where it comes from. And that kind of is the well or the spring for what we do, and accepting people, sitting with people, and the deeper meaning for us is what Jesus has done for us. There's a hymn that we sing at the end of every service in my local church, and we have this hope. And I was just reading the comments in the chat, and one of the questions was, is there hope? And yes, 100% there is hope. And for us as Adventists, we have this hope, and it burns within our souls, hope in the coming of our Lord. And that song, we sing it and you can feel the power, and there is so much hope, and there is hope for everybody wherever they are at. And that is not only the message of the gospel, but just as a church, the message that we bring to the world. But yeah, there is so much hope.
Beautifully said, Andrea. Thank you. Yeah, I would just say, let's just keep on raising the awareness, and educating even from our young people. To teach our teens what safety, what healthy relationships look like and what they don't look like. Also another thing I'd like to add as well, those people who do help, they can be prone to vicarious trauma as well. So other people's trauma can affect them. So they need help. They need to find help as well, and to talk it out. because it can affect them. But yeah, no, we are so privileged to have the Bible, to have the hope that we have, and the Bible's all about safety and love and care for each other, and God just wants to provide and give us that too.
Well, thank you to each of you. I honestly feel like I've done each of you a great disservice in not being able to listen to you for longer, because you have a lot of wisdom, and I really appreciate, for me personally, and I can see that our audience also really appreciates everything you've had to share this evening. So Colleen, Ingrid, Andrea, Horatio, thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us this evening, and sharing some of your wisdom and your experience, and I suppose your guidance and advice and direction for us as an Adventist church, as individual Christians, on how we can deal with some of these issues surrounding trauma. We are very grateful. And I do want to, before we close for this evening, thank everybody who's been sending in questions. I apologize that we have not nearly had enough time to deal with those all tonight. And maybe next time we host one of these summits, we'll get people to send in their questions beforehand, because that's always part of the challenge. You start going on a great discussion, and then you have another question that's in a different area, and how can we possibly reach them all? But I do want to remind people that if you have questions that haven't been answered and you need somebody to talk to about that, please make sure you reach out to the counselling service that's been available through this evening. The number is 0450 732 377, and a counsellor will get back to you. There are also the public health lines that are available for people to talk to, 1-800-RESPECT, also Lifeline and Men's Line Australia. One thing I do also want to mention just briefly before we close is something I think Colleen mentioned. There is a PDF version of a booklet that is called Breaking the Silence. And this is to do with this whole topic of trauma that we've been talking about, where people go through challenging things and they don't know what to do. They don't know who to talk to. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to reach out. Maybe they don't have anyone they feel they can trust. We would like to encourage you to visit enditnowaustralia.org.au. Get your hands on this resource. It's absolutely free, and we hope that it can be something that can assist you in the journey, whether it's dealing with trauma for you or for somebody that you know or love. Just want to also say before we finish tonight a few thank yous. Obviously, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Ingrid, Horatio, Colleen, and Andrea. Thank you to Dr. Torben, or even though he's not with us personally. I do also want to say thank you to the moderators that have been with us on the live stream. So to Beryl, to Wendy, to Darren, to Meleofa, and to Uli. Also want to say thank you to Samantha and Sylvia, who have been working very hard in the background, making sure everything that we've been doing in StreamYard here has been running smoothly. And also want to say thank you to our counsellors and psychologists who have been taking calls and messages throughout this evening. We're very grateful for everybody who's been a part of this summit. I feel as though, mate, once a year is not nearly enough to actually go through and deal with some of these sorts of questions. And as you can see there, Darren Pratt, we have a message on the screen for those who are in the Greater Sydney area. There is actually going to be a physical End It Now rally tomorrow. Sylvia Mendez will be speaking at that, and Sylvia always has a lot of great wisdom to share. So if you are in the Greater Sydney area, I'd encourage you to attend the rally tomorrow at Mountain View Adventist School in Doomside, starting from 3 p.m. Before we wrap up, I'd just like to conclude with a prayer, if that's okay. Okay. Father God, we thank you that you have been with us. We thank you that you are always with us through the good times and the bad times of life. We thank you that you are a great counselor too, and that we can come to you with our problems. We thank you also that you have blessed so many people in our church with incredible gifts to be able to provide counsel and help and healing to those in need. And we are all in need. So Lord, I just thank you for everything you've done for us, that you do for us. And I thank you that we have the opportunity to have these conversations, and we look forward to a brighter future. And we look forward to healing for everybody who has experienced trauma in their life. So we thank you for this. We thank you for this End It Now Summit. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, thank you so much, everybody.
Amen.
And I'm looking forward to doing this again sometime. I know I've personally learned a whole lot. So thank you to each and every one of you for investing the time in sharing your wisdom and knowledge this evening.
Thank you.